Decoded.
Welcome to Book Decoded. Ever feel like there are these huge, almost unseen forces changing the companies and services you rely on every day?
Oh, absolutely. Things shift, and sometimes it's hard to know why.
Exactly. So in this podcast episode, we're diving into a really fascinating book. It pulls back the curtain on one of those powerful forces, private equity.
Right. And it's not just dry finance talk, is it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Forget the complex jargon for a second. This is really about the real world impact. We're talking jobs, housing, hospitals.
Even like where you used to buy toys.
Yeah. Get ready for some pretty eye-opening stories straight from the pages we've been looking at.
It's true. When you start digging into it, the footprint of private equity is, well, it's surprisingly big.
Bigger than you'd think.
Much bigger. The sources we're exploring, they really highlight its reach way beyond just Wall Street, It's deep into essential services, major industries all over the country.
Like what specifically?
Well, the book mentions a huge chunk of private hospitals, a lot of U.S. oil and gas production, the biggest for-profit daycare chains.
Wow.
Supermarket chains, local newspapers, even companies making voting machines, apparently.
So it's kind of everywhere. The book mentions some massive numbers too, doesn't it? Something about assets.
Yeah, staggering numbers. They apparently control assets worth something like $8.2 trillion.
$8.2 trillion. That's hard to even picture.
It really is. To put it in perspective, that's more value than the GDP of almost any country on Earth.
Okay. And the firms themselves, like Blackstone is mentioned, what's their stated goal?
Well, the stated mission often is framed as creating long-term value for their investors, making companies stronger, more efficient.
Which on the surface sounds fine. Sounds good even.
It does, but the book quickly digs into a really crucial distinction in how private equity often defines that value.
Okay, what's the distinction?
What's really fascinating and central to the book's argument is that for private equity, value often means one thing: return on investment. ROI.
Just the financial return.
Primarily, yes. And the sources describe a core tool they use, the leveraged buyout, the LBO.
Right, I've heard of that, leveraged buyout.
That's basically buying a company using a huge amount of borrowed money. And often it's the company being bought that gets saddled with the debt from its own purchase.
Okay, so the firm buys the company, but makes the company borrow the money to pay for it.
That's a common structure, yes. And according to the research in the book, this intense focus on ROI, often fueled by all that LBO debt, tends to make, wealthy finance executives even richer.
But what about the company or the community?
That's the tension. The book argues it can sometimes come at the expense of the very places where these buyouts happen. It can really strain local businesses, local communities.
And that's where the individual stories the book tells really hit home, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Liz from Toys R Us.
Exactly. A perfect example. She saw stores struggling, needing investment, like more staff, updates, basic things.
But the private equity owners, it was KKR and Bain Capital, right?
Yes. They seemed, according to the reporting, to prioritize other financial maneuvers over investing back into the actual stores.
And we all know what happened to Toys R Us.
Right. The book details how it eventually collapsed under competitive pressure, sure, but also under that huge debt load from the buyout.
But did the private equity firms lose out?
Here's the kicker. They bought it for $5 billion, mostly borrowed money or other people's capital. But the book states they actually made money more than their initial investment through fees and debt shuffling before it even went bankrupt.
Wow. Well, workers like Anne Marie, who'd been there nearly 30 years.
Yeah, people like her faced immense hardship, lost jobs, lost severance, difficulty finding new work. It was devastating for many.
That really shows the human cost, doesn't it? But the sources also talk about how the workers fought back, using a group called Rise Up Retail.
They did. It was quite a bold move, actually. They went directly to the pension funds.
The pension funds that had invested in KKR and Bain.
Exactly. Their logic, as the book explains, was that maybe the actual workers and retirees on those pension fund boards would be more sympathetic than the PE executives.
Did it work?
It led to something. That campaign, showing up at meetings, putting a human face on it, it resulted in KKR and Bain contributing $20 million to a hardship fund for the former workers.
$20 million. That's something, I guess.
It wasn't everything the workers felt they were owed, not by a long shot, but as the book points out, it was significant, pretty much unprecedented for PE firms to pay workers anything after a company they owned failed.
So that tension, financial return versus community well-being, it's not just retail. The book goes into healthcare too.
Oh, absolutely. A big focus. We see the story of Sage West Hospital in rural Wyoming. It was owned by LifePoint and Apollo, more private equity involvement.
And there was a contrast, right, between an older doctor and the new approach.
Yeah, the book highlights a doctor like Roger who sort of embodied the old community-focused medicine. But under PE ownership, the hospital became profitable mainly by, well, consolidating services and cutting staff.
And the most chilling part, closing the obstetrics department.
Permanently closing it in Riverton. Why? Because, as the sources detail, it just wasn't deemed cost-effective.
Even while the hospital's overall profit margin nearly doubled.
Exactly. Profits went way up, but now patients needing to deliver a baby, they have to drive miles and miles away.
That's stark.
It is. And the book quotes a consultant making the point clear. Nonprofit hospitals can prioritize community needs, but PE-owned ones are, in his words, driven by an external force that relentless pressure for short-term returns for investors.
This same dynamic, the book argues, plays out in local news, something many see as, a public good.
Right. Journalism has gone through what the book calls financialization, basically treating news outlets less like vital community resources and more like assets you just extract cash from.
Like Gatehouse and Alden, the firms buying up papers.
Yeah, notorious examples, aggressively cutting staff, slashing resources, even closing papers entirely just to maximize cash flow, creating what they call news deserts.
And the impact of that.
The sources suggest it means less civic engagement, less government accountability. Communities are left without reliable local information. Journalists like Natalia mentioned in the book, working in these shrinking newsrooms while executives made millions. It's a tough picture.
And then there's housing. Something totally fundamental.
Yep. Private equity moving into apartment complexes, sometimes using government-backed loans that were actually meant to support affordable housing.
But then the priority shifts.
To boosting investor returns. So rent hikes, cutting back on maintenance. The story of Lauren at Southern Towers is a really powerful example in the book.
What happened there?
Tenants facing terrible conditions like flooding, neglect. But the owners, CIM Group, seemed more focused on cosmetic upgrades to justify pushing for maximum rent increases allowed by law.
Did the tenants manage to change things?
Lauren was a real activist, organized the penance, but ultimately, despite her efforts, she and her family were displaced, priced out.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Whose interests come first when essential things like housing or healthcare are controlled by entities focused purely on ROI?
It does, and the fight back, whether it's renters or the Toys R Us workers, often means trying to pressure the sources of capital, the big investors behind the PE firms. But that's a huge, huge challenge.
Yeah.
It is. So this look inside the book, it really just underscores how this world of high finance, specifically private equity with its laser focus on return on investment, can have these massive, sometimes really damaging consequences for the rest of us.
Yeah, impacting everything, where you work, where you live, your health care, the news you get.
Exactly. It just starkly highlights that fundamental tension, doesn't it, between maximizing profits for a select few and ensuring the well-being of communities and access to vital services for everyone else.
So what does all this mean for how we should think about the businesses that are just, well, essential parts of our everyday lives? Definitely something to keep mulling over long after this podcast episode ends.